So this screencast we're going to have a look at minority influence as a reminder of what we mean by majority influence, and then I'm going to introduce the idea of minority influence. So majority influence is yielding to real or imagined group pressure. This is also known as conformity. So the majority group are influencing the minority. And minority influence is the exact opposite. So it's one person or a small group of people influencing the beliefs and behaviour of a larger group. So these two ideas are pretty much opposites: majority influencing minority, or minority influencing majority. So minority influence very often, more often than not, leads to internalisation. So the private view and the public view change, then the person internalises the idea of the minority. So why does this need to happen? Well, put it this way: if you have an idea and you're in the minority in society, and you have a belief that not very many other people in society hold or believe, it's really important that you change their private view, otherwise they're going to just kind of bat away the ideas. So examples might be things like getting people to recycle or getting people to support gay marriage. It's absolutely vital that you get that majority on board and that they internalise those ideas, otherwise nothing's going to change in society. They're not going to just comply with your ideas because they are the majority, and it's not in their interest to do that. So a few examples of minority influence before we move on. We've talked on a previous screencast about the suffragettes. Top right you can see they were in the minority to start with. Most people believed that it wouldn't be right for women to vote and women shouldn't have the vote, and they influenced through a small minority of women. They campaigned, they kind of really fought their cause, and eventually, now I'm sure if you ask most people, do women deserve the right to vote, most people would say yes. So the minority have influenced the majority. Second of all, you've got on the top left hand side Martin Luther King. Again, small minority of mainly black people who felt that they should have equal rights with people of other ethnicities, and that idea again started quite small with campaigners such as Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, and this idea grew and grew and grew. And again, if you ask people today, most people, the majority of people in today's society, would say yes, people of all the ethnicities deserve equal rights. So again, a minority, small group has influenced the majority. Final example you've got at the bottom is Greenpeace. So you may or may not know that Greenpeace were kind of the first people to introduce recycling. It wasn't a very popular idea. They were seen as kind of hippies and a little bit kind of backwards. And same as the other two examples, so they started as a minority and it grew and grew and grew. And again, the same, if you ask most people nowadays, is recycling the right thing to do, they would probably say yes. So we're going to have a look at how minorities are successful, and there's three key ways that we'll look at today. So first of all, consistency, second of all, flexibility, and third of all, commitment. Now they're important key terms. You need to know them for the exam, and you need to know how minorities use them. So consistency, there's two different types of consistency. One's called synchronic consistency, which means the minority are consistent between themselves. So all members of that minority are arguing the same point consistently, and you've not got one going off on a different point. And the second one is diachronic consistency, and this means consistency over time. So they're always arguing the same argument, the same case over a long period of time. They're not changing their argument from month to month. And what this does, it gives the majority a reason to kind of doubt themselves and reflect on their own behaviour. So they start to think to themselves, okay, they're arguing consistently, they're all arguing the same thing, they've been arguing it for a long time now, maybe they have a point. Second of all is flexibility. So it's important that the minority can adapt their point of view, accept reasonable and valid counter arguments. So a good example of this is in terms of gay marriage, when the government passed the Civil Partnership Act, and they were allowed to engage in civil partnerships but not yet marriage. People in same-sex relationships, they accepted that, they adapted their point of view. They didn't just dismiss the idea of a civil partnership and say, no, there's no way we're doing that. A lot of gay people did take on a civil partnership, but then they carried on arguing consistently. So they showed that flexibility by taking on that reasonable argument, by taking on that little bit of gained ground, but they also continued to argue consistently. And finally, commitment. This might be shown by extreme activities. So the best example here is probably the suffragettes, who would do things like throw themselves in front of racehorses, and they would stop eating, and they would, kind of starve themselves in prisons when they were locked up, and they would chain themselves to fences. So that it was very, very extreme. They showed a high level of commitment to their cause. Other examples might be Greenpeace, kind of activists. In the 90s, they would do things like have sit-ins, they would climb up trees, refuse to move, so they couldn't cut down the trees. So both very, very extreme activities there, showing a high level of commitment. What does this do? So it makes the majority think, well, wow, he must really believe in what he's saying, so perhaps I should take on what he's saying, and I should consider his view. And this is what we call the augmentation principle. So it's when extreme activities have happened, so the majority start to look into why this is, and they start considering the views of the minority. Other processes in minority influence. So there's also the snowball effect, which you may have come across before, and this is a metaphor, so it's not a physical actual snowball, but it's the idea that the snowball effect is a process that starts from an initial state of small significance, and it builds upon itself, getting larger and larger and larger. So it starts with something small minority, as you can see in the diagram here, gets bigger as it rolls down the hill. It gathers speed, it gathers momentum, and it gathers extra snow, so it gets larger and larger and larger. And at one point there will be no going back, so there'll be no return after that point, until then it becomes the majority view. So moving us on to a famous study of minority influence by a researcher named Moscovici. So the aim was to investigate the effects of a consistent minority on the majority. So Moscovici conducted a rerun of Ash's experiment, but in reverse. Now, he didn't use Ash's lines, he instead used different stimuli, so he used green and blue slides, and instead of Ash, as we know, Ash had a majority of Confederates and one naive participant. Moscovici almost did the opposite. So instead of one subject amongst a majority of Confederates, he placed 2 Confederates together with 4 genuine participants. So the genuine participants this time were the majority, and the minority influence was coming from the Confederates. The participants were first given eye tests to ensure they weren't colourblind. So this was really important in making sure they weren't just going along with saying the slides were one colour or the other colour just because they couldn't see them properly. So, method. It was a lab experiment, so it's conducted in a lab setting. As I've said, there was 4 real participants and 2 Confederates. As we know, the 2 Confederates were the ones who were kind of giving the minority influence. The participants were shown 36 slides, and they were very, very clearly different shades of blue. They were not green, they didn't look green, they were very clearly blue shades. And the participants were asked to state the colour of each slide out loud. Now, there was 2 conditions. In the first condition, the 2 Confederates answered green 24 times and blue 12 times. So they were inconsistent in their answers. And in the second condition, they were again shown the blue slides, and the 2 Confederates answered green for all 36 slides. So they were totally consistent in their responses. So the left-hand side, you've got the inconsistent condition, and the right-hand side, you've got the consistent condition. And what Moscovici wanted to find out was, would the responses of the 2 Confederates influence those of the 4 participants? In other words, would the 2 Confederates be the minority influence? Would they influence those 4 participants? So looking at the results, remember that the independent variable is whether the minority answered consistently or inconsistently, and the dependent variable was the answer given, so whether the majority answered blue or whether they answered green. And remember, green is the wrong answer, so if the majority answered green, this means that the minority did have an influence. If the majority answered blue, then this means the minority didn't have so much of an influence. So when the minority were consistent, the majority said green, remember the wrong answer, about 8% of the time. And when the minority were inconsistent, the majority only said green 1% of the time. Now, those numbers don't sound too different. They don't sound very high. So you're probably thinking, oh, well, hang on a minute, that's not much of a difference. But it's important to remember that that's about 8 times as many people, i.e. the majority, answered green when the minority were consistent than when they were inconsistent. So consistency versus inconsistency has a big effect. Okay, yep, the numbers are low, but it's still 8 times as many wrong answers. I'll also draw your attention to the control. They also did some conditions where they weren't given any other answers, and they were just asked, was the slide green or blue, and less than 0.5% of the time they got that wrong. So it wasn't that the slides looked green, it was that they were going along with this consistent or inconsistent minority. So conclusion, Moscovici suggested that minorities can influence a majority, but not all the time, and only when they behave in certain ways, so when they show a consistent behaviour style. He's saying not all the time because, as I said, those numbers are quite low. 8% is still not a massive amount of influence. So finally, test yourself before you come into the lesson. Make sure that you can explain the difference between minority and majority influence. Number 2, explain how minority influence can occur using those processes that I've talked about earlier in the PowerPoint. Number 3, be able to give real-life examples of minority influence. And finally, outline Moscovici's study, aim, method, results, conclusion.